Welcome to lesson 6, and we are going to do a mini lesson on the slave patrol as well as white supremacy in the police body and the juxtaposition of that over black and brown bodies. So, as always, I am going to read from several items and then we're going to have a very brief conversation about them. So, first, I am reading from the National Law Enforcement Officers Memorial Fund website, and it is the NLEOMF.org website. One thing I do want to point out is I am purposely trying to take you to other sources so that you'll be able to go and look up this information yourself. So take that information as you will. I am going to start from the page Slave Patrols, an Early Form of American Policing. I, patroller's name, do swear that I will, as a searcher for guns, swords, and other weapons among the slaves of my district, faithfully and as privately as I can, discharge the trust reposed in me as the law directs to the best of my power, so help me God. That was a slave patroller's oath in North Carolina in 1828. And I'm going to jump to a paragraph and we're going to go to my grandmother's hands. The American South relied almost exclusively on slave labor, and white Southerners lived in near constant fear of slave rebellions disrupting this economic status quo. As a result, these patrols were one of the earliest and most prolific forms of early policing in the South. The responsibility of patrols was straightforward: to control the movements and behaviors of enslaved populations. According to historian Gary Potter, slave patrols serve three main functions. 1, to chase down, apprehend, and return to their owners runaway slaves. 2, to provide a form of organized terror to deter slave riots. And 3, to maintain a form of discipline for slave workers who were subject to summary justice outside the law. One more piece. Typically, slave patrol routines included enforcing curfews, checking travelers for a permission pass, catching those assembling without permission, and preventing any form of organized resistance. As historian Sally Haddon writes in her book Slave Patrols, Law and Violence in Virginia and the Carolinas, she quotes, "The history of police work in the South grows out of this early fascination by white patrollers with what African American slaves were doing. Most law enforcement was, by definition, white patrolmen watching, catching, or beating back black slaves." Now, I purposely read this piece because if you listened as I was reading that, a lot of things should start to come to the forefront of your mind in terms of looking back at slave patrols and putting that side by side to modern day policing, especially for black men and any melanated person that exists in the Americas. And I'm going to pull now into my grandmother's hands, and I want to purposely read a couple of items from here. In the book, My Grandmother's Hands, it reads, "What will happen if, quote unquote, I was scared to death results in the acquittal of enough police officers who have shot dark-skinned human beings? Will that phrase become the standard default defense, the magic words of almost any law enforcement professional who pumps bullets into a person of color? Note, by the way, how I, quote unquote, feared my life perfectly combines white fragility, imagined black imperviousness and invincibility, and the lizard brain annihilation response. Have we crossed that line already? Are American police officers now sanctioned to shoot dark bodies at will with a tacit understanding that saying I was scared to death in court will exonerate them? If so, then should black men routinely be frightened of being shot by police, especially when they are pulled over for little or no reason? What if one of those black drivers, scared to death, were to shoot the police officer who pulled them over? Does quote unquote, I fear for my life constitute a valid defense for that dark skinned man? If it does, then we are in deep trouble. If it does not, but it becomes one for police, then we are also in deep trouble. I'm going to skip ahead. In some ways, even though there was a time when police officers were called peace officers, many people who live in black and brown bodies know that that isn't always the case. Case in point, slave patrols. Now I'm going back to the book. In some ways, police culture has got things exactly backward. White body supremacy and fragility have charged our law enforcement professionals with managing black bodies, when what many public safety professionals need most is to learn how to manage their own bodies. Trauma is anything the body perceives as too much, too fast, or too soon. Whenever trauma is involved, the first step in mending any relationship or any emotional dysregulation involves working through that trauma. And in order for someone to do that trauma work, he or she must first learn to slow down, observe his or her body, and allow it to settle. I'm going to stop there. So the reason why I purposely read those two or several excerpts from the website as well as the book is because I need you to see that in the 1800s to today, the experience of black and brown bodies with the police has not changed. We see over and over and over again how many black bodies, I'm going to keep to this particular example, are murdered, beaten, brutalized, and there is often no regard for those bodies because of said stereotypes, because of which we are going to get into that with this book later, about how white men specifically have often viewed black people when they enslaved them. Now, in many instances, particularly with discourses online, you have often heard, why aren't the black people standing up? Why aren't you doing this? Why aren't you doing that? And notice how all of these various pieces of legislation have also come to protect black people in this country, to be so that we can be seen as humans, as citizens in a society that has often treated us as less than, as animals. Think about the 3/5 compromise. That is also an example of black bodies in the United States were not seen as a whole person. And I want you to think about this, and this is going to be your assignment. Every time we have seen black people in the United States stand up for the rights of others, what happens? What happens? Usually those people are met with some form of violence and brutality. And oftentimes we do not see anyone come to support those bodies. So when the question is often asked, why aren't the black people stepping up? Why are black women resting? You need to get up and do something. I really want people to think about this, especially if you are a white person. Many white women have been taught to uphold white supremacy and support their partners. When black men have often gone and tried to speak up and try to do things, they have traditionally and historically been seen as less than human. So, of course, when those bodies start to speak up, what makes you think that martial law isn't going to be instituted when that starts to happen? And should that happen, what are you going to do as a white person to support those black bodies? So when you hear black women especially saying, I am resting, I am not doing all those things, I am not protesting, I am not getting up, again, go back and do your research and look at the images. And if they are in black and white, I want you to search for them in color of what it looked like for black and men and women in this country to fight.